John, thank you. Joining us now to react to President Biden's emergency meetings with NATO allies is Arkansas Republican Senator Tom Cotton. So, Senator, we just got word a couple minutes ago that we're going to hear from the president. This press conference is now expected to happen 1:30 p.m. Eastern time, about 19 minutes from now at NATO headquarters. So we will be listening for that. In anticipation of that, we know the president's plans to welcome 100,000 Ukrainian refugees here and to also donate $1 billion to Europe to help with the surge of migrants there. Is this enough?
No, Sandra, it's not enough. I hope the president accelerating his press conference shows that he's finally got a sense of urgency, which is still lacking in the administration's response. You know, statements of unity and group pictures at the NATO headquarters is not going to stop Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. The Ukrainians need more weapons. They need them faster. What we need from the president is to get out of this mindset of trying to end the war. Instead, we need to help Ukraine win the war. And they're only going to win if we continue to supply them with the weapons that they're asking for, if we give them more weapons and we give them those weapons faster, and we take more economic sanctions against Russia. For instance, we're still importing Russian oil to this day. The Russian stock market just opened today. They're just paid off their first round of foreign debt payments. Obviously, the sanctions are not yet tough enough. So I hope the president accelerating his press conference today shows that he's going to accelerate his responses to Russia's unprovoked naked war of aggression.
You know, what you're saying dovetails with what the American public is telling us in a Fox News poll. Let's put it up on the screen. Asked whether or not the United States should be doing more to help Ukraine fight Russia, 63% of people say yes, 32% of people say no. Listen to what your colleague Lindsey Graham said earlier today on that point.
If we had anti-ship missiles, we could sink most of their Navy. Denying them the MiGs is irresponsible and unconscionable. So this administration, when it comes to Ukraine, is incredibly slow, incredibly indecisive.
Incredibly slow, incredibly indecisive. You said yourself, Senator, that there doesn't seem to be a push here by the Biden administration to help Ukraine win. And I'm wondering if that's because they thought that Putin was going to roll over Ukraine in a couple of days and they hadn't prepared for this contingency and they're not quite sure what to do.
John, I think that's part of it. And frankly, I think some of our partners in Europe were kind of hoping that would happen, that they didn't think that there's any way to help Ukraine defend its territory. And they wanted, if Russia was going to invade, they want it to be over with quickly. Unfortunately, I think that mindset is still prevailing in some places. You saw the president's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, just a couple days ago at a press conference. He was asked about winning, and he deflected both times. He talked about a phased approach to supplying defensive weapons. Well, this parsing and all of the fine distinctions between defensive and offensive weapons, John, to me is beside the point. Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine is defending its territory. By definition, every weapon Ukraine has is a defensive weapon. We shouldn't be drawing these fine distinctions. We should be supplying them with more weapons and more kinds of weapons so they can win this war and get Russian troops off of their soil.
Meanwhile, Senator, to the lines of communication with Russia, obviously you have seen and heard that top Russian military leaders have repeatedly declined calls from the U.S., prompting fears of sleepwalking into war. John Kirby, the Pentagon spokesperson, was on Fox News earlier today, responded to those lines of communication in the struggle to reach Russia. Listen.
We think that communication with the Russians is important, particularly now. In fact, now more than ever, to be able to communicate with our Russian counterparts. We have tried on numerous occasions to connect Secretary Austin with his counterpart. Chairman Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has also tried to connect with his counterpart. We've made multiple attempts here, but they have not answered up. They've declined to take these calls.
What does all of that tell you, Senator?
Well, I think the Russian General Staff and Ministry of Defense is under tremendous pressure from Vladimir Putin because they have failed so badly in their campaign to rapidly seize Kyiv and topple the Ukrainian government. We always want to maintain open lines of communications, even with our enemies in a war, to ensure that they don't make tactical mistakes on the battlefield. We did that with Russia in Syria, for instance, when we destroyed several hundred troops from a Russian paramilitary company in 2018. However, we are not going to sleepwalk into a war. The way we might get into a war is if we continue to signal to Vladimir Putin that he has the initiative, that he's on the front foot. Look, his military is struggling terribly in Ukraine. Now is a moment to show strength, to show that we are standing firm with Ukraine, that we stand behind all of our NATO partners. That's the way, not just to end this war in Ukraine, but to win the war.
You know, as Russia's military continues to struggle in Ukraine, there's increasing fears that Putin may resort to other measures to try to gain ground, whether they be chemical, biological, maybe even nuclear. NATO is providing Ukraine with defenses against chemical. It's also bolstering its own defenses near the border there. But when it comes to nuclear, listen to what Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin mouthpiece, said about the potential of Russia using those. Listen here.
We have a concept of domestic security. And, well, it's public. You can read all the reasons for nuclear arms to be used. So if it is an existential threat for our country, then it can be used in accordance with our concept.
So the key in military doctrine in Russia is an existential threat. And you would think that losing an invasion that you precipitated in Ukraine would not represent an existential threat. But Russia can try to spin this any way they want. What do you think might happen here?
Well, John, another key part of Russian military doctrine going back decades is to threaten these kind of attacks, to include nuclear attacks as a way to bluff the United States and the West into backing down. And frankly, I'm afraid that's what happened a couple weeks ago whenever the administration green-lighted the provision of these Polish MiGs to Ukraine. Vladimir Putin rattled the nuclear saber briefly, and then somehow providing those MiGs would be dangerously provocative. I think President Biden got bluffed, and frankly, I think he got scared. This is not the kind of threat, though, that we can back down from. Again, Vladimir Putin's military has bitten off more than it can chew in Ukraine. Do we really think that it wants a piece of NATO? It probably doesn't want a piece of Poland by itself, much less Poland supported by 29 NATO partners, including the United States. That's why it's time to stand strong, to be firm and resolute, and not be rattled by Russia's threats.
Senator Tom Cotton, thank you for joining us as we have